Welcome back to a year of Final Fantasy, and today we're talking about the game of the month, Final Fantasy IV. This is a big one for me. To be completely transparent, Final Fantasy IV is one of my favorites of the series, and especially probably in the top 3. The game has been released many times over the years, and there's a ton to talk about, so let's just dive in. And actually, we can't dive in because of this nonsense that Square put us through. In case this is one of your first videos that you're watching of mine, I'll go over this just real quick. The original Final Fantasy II came out on the NES, and it actually wasn't released to the Western world until Final Fantasy Origins came out on the PS1. So the Final Fantasy IV that we know today was actually named Final Fantasy II for the Super Nintendo. So that being said, let's just talk about the SNES Super Famicom version as it was originally released way back in 1991. So with it being released in 1991, it's actually remarkable that it actually launched so close together with both Japan and the West. In Japan, it launched on July 19th, 1991, and in the West, over here in the States, it was November 23rd, 1991, which is just super impressive, seeing how many awful translated games came during this early portion of the industry. And that's not to say Final Fantasy IV didn't have its problems, but still, those are really close together in how they released. During the development of the game, there's some pretty interesting information here in the fact that after Final Fantasy III, there were 2 Final Fantasy games that were in production. One of them was for the Famicom, and then the other one was for the Super Famicom, or Super Nintendo as we know it over here. These were to be Final Fantasy IV and V, but there's something weird that happened. At this point, in the early 90s, the NES was pretty much rapidly ending its life, and then everyone was turning to the Super Nintendo, and as such, Final Fantasy being developed on the NES or the Famicom was just basically completely scrapped, and then the named Final Fantasy V game was actually the Final Fantasy IV that we've seen today. Now, I said that original game, the NES game, was scrapped completely. I've seen reports that that scrapped game, at least some of the ideas maybe, have been turned into Seiken Densetsu 2, or as you might know it, Secret of Mana, but there's a lot of wishy-washy information about that. So, as the game made its way over here, it was renamed to Final Fantasy II like I talked about at the beginning, and I do think this was kind of maybe to avoid some parody with the Star Wars, maybe Episode 4 A New Hope kind of thing, because everyone was always wondering, where's Episode 1, 2, and 3? And then we got Episode 1, 2, and 3, and, well, we know how all that turned out. But just to keep consumers happy, because we didn't get Final Fantasy 3 or 2, they just renamed this game. But then the internet came around and everyone started finding out that we didn't get those games, and they finally re-released the big ones over here. Now it's just a big cluster of nonsense. But I think in the original days, they did that, just to keep things simple. It didn't turn out that way, but that's what we got. So, as far as the game itself goes, we get what I would term basically like a true modern Final Fantasy game. While Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3 laid a fantastic groundwork, and they are good games, this game really feels like a total complete melding of all of these games' ideas while pushing the envelope on its own for what Final Fantasy would be known for in its later years. So this being the first actual game to take a hard stance on the story, I do want to take a look at that story and the narrative and really the characters to see what this first real Final Fantasy gives us in terms of story arc, character progression, and individuality. In this game, characters join and leave the party actually multiple times throughout the story as they go ahead and attend to their own agendas, so you're not stuck with the same 4 characters for the entire game, and that's one thing that really we hadn't seen yet in a Final Fantasy series, at least to this degree. In Final Fantasy II that did happen, but just the frequency of which that happens here and how they all tie the stories into one another is masterfully done. So this is really the first game that delves into characters in such a very deep way. Now, looking back on it, it's actually not that deep, but for what games had been known for up until then, this is a novel compared to some of the other storylines in games. So let's get a rundown of most of the characters that we're going to meet during the course of the adventure. Of course, I'm not going to post spoilers or talk about spoilers, just giving you like a basic overview of our characters and why people like them so much. First off, let's go with Cecil Harvey. Now, if you watched my Paladin Dark Knight video, you'll already be familiar with him a little bit, but he's our main protagonist, and he begins the game as a Dark Knight, but he does go through a change and becomes a Paladin. And I debated if I should address that Paladin issue, because it may be a spoiler, but really, if you look at Final Fantasy IV, Cecil just is a Paladin. It's in all of the marketing material. And to be fair, he becomes a Paladin fairly early in the game, so yeah, I'm kind of going against my spoiler stuff a little bit, but he's everywhere, and if it hasn't already been spoiled for you, then I'm sorry. This is my apology to you. But he cannot be talked about without mentioning him as a Paladin, because he's that way for most of the game. And it's really interesting, though, that Cecil is actually the poster boy for Final Fantasy for both Dark Knights and Paladins. That's just mind-blowing to me. And next, like the latter one, I've talked about the Highwind family before, so you may be familiar with Kain Highwind if you've watched those videos. He's Cecil's best friend, and being of the Highwind name, he's a Dragoon, and indeed one of the most well-known Dragoons in the series. Kain goes through a major arc of his own, and he plays a huge role in being so close to Cecil, like a brother really, so it adds that element of drama there with how the game plays out. He's also very affectionate to Rosa, who I'll talk about in a second, and it creates an interesting love triangle if you're into that kind of stuff. Again, you have to remember that back in the early 90s, video games just didn't have much of this. So next, of course, is Rosa Farrell, and she is the love interest of Cecil and secretly Kain. She's met at the beginning of the game, and she's the game's white mage / archer. And she does play the captured princess tropes a little bit at some points, but mostly she finds herself in those situations due to her going out and adventuring and trying to find Cecil or her friends. So it's not like a helpless kind of prisoner situation. She gets herself into these predicaments because she is an adventurer herself, and it's really cool that we see that. Next up is Rydia. She's met incredibly early in the game under some very, very tragic circumstances, of which Cecil's a part of, and I'll leave it there. If you want to find out, definitely play. She is a powerful summoner and has some major, for lack of a better word, transformations in the game, and I'll leave it at that. Rydia is the first prominent summoner in the series, just as a whole. And in the story that she has going through the game, it is just so awesome. There's a lot of twists and turns there that I absolutely love. Next up, we meet Tella, and he's basically an old wise man. His proper title is Sage, which is essentially a white mage and a black mage combined. But I don't want to give you the impression that he's a red mage, because he is just purely focused on magic and magic alone. He's known the world over, at least in the game terms, and he's found on his way to rescue his daughter. He also has one of the most iconic lines in the entire Final Fantasy franchise altogether. So let's say it, it's "You Spoony Bard." Everyone knows that line that, enjoys Final Fantasy. "You Spoony Bard." It's become a staple of the series, and even in retranslations, re-releases of the game, they keep that "You Spoony Bard" quote because it's just so iconic to the series. It's really funny. So what do you mean, you Spoony Bard? Who's the Spoony Bard? Well, that would be our next character that we'll talk about. His name is Edward Chris von Muir. M-U-I-R. He's a prince and a bard who eloped with Tella's daughter, which is why you meet Tella. And his story is one of strength, I guess, starting off as a completely worthless, spineless individual that lacks confidence. And you probably know where the story goes as you play along, so I'll just leave it at that. Next up, we have Yang Feng Leiden, and he's our prominent monk of the series, and he is from the Kingdom of Fabul. His story is less involved, but even still, it's pretty compelling, and he does have a purpose within the story, and he has a really good dynamic to the party as the honorable, wise monk. And the next, I'm going to group both of these people together. We have Palom and Porum, some of the most fun characters in the game. They're fairly young children who are twin mages from the town called Mysidia. Palom is the black mage. He's a young boy, and he's rowdy and uncouth, and just a young kid. They're all over the place, mischievous and everything. Porum now is our white mage, and she is more prim and proper. She's kind of the caretaker, even though she's the twin of Palom. She's the more adult one, let's just say that. Both are at each other's throats all the time, having jabs back and forth, but that's just what makes them so fun to watch. And also, mechanically speaking, this is one of the first times in the series that we actually get to see two characters combine and unleash a super cool ability, and that's because they're twins and how they interact. It's just a really cool duo of characters. And now, since we're getting on in the series, of course, we have to have a Sid. So Sid is in the game. He's playable briefly, and he's the chief engineer of Baron. He works on airships, and he's met pretty early in the game, in fact, really early in the game. And he's somewhat of a father figure, I guess, to Cecil and Rosa, and I assume Kane. And the last character I'm going to talk about is going to be Edge. Now, I'm not going to tell you he's the last character you meet or get in your party, but it's the last one I'm willing to talk about, spoiler free. And he is Edge, like I said. He's a royal prince of Eblan, and he's the ninja of the party. In my eyes, he's kind of the anti-Edward. Edward being the spineless bard. He's pretty much, as you might expect, like a ninja, very overconfident, likes to take on enemies by himself. You know, he thinks he can do stuff. So, like Edward is a prince, but they are very, very just dynamically opposite in that way. Whew, okay, that's a lot of characters for the game, main characters in the game. And like I said, there are some more characters you'll meet here and there, but I don't really want to touch them. Right now, just with the amount of characters that we have, though, you can see that there's going to be a lot of dynamic story events that happen in this game. Interestingly enough, as I found out while I was researching all of this stuff, the game was actually cut down by 1/4 of its original length simply to fit on a cartridge size. Now, they still kept most of the story, obviously. Some of this cut material, though, has made it into the remakes, the DS remakes and PSP remakes that I'll talk about here in a little while. With Final Fantasy IV, just in general with the story, each character is really an iconic character that represents the jobs of the Final Fantasy series in this game, and that's why I love it. It takes crystals, it takes jobs, it takes airships, fleshed out stories, summons, even futuristic ideas that we've seen in previous Final Fantasy games, and it just meshes them all together into what I consider almost a perfect game, just with how the game is structured and how well the story is told, how easy it is to get into the story. I absolutely love this game. I love it so much. With that being said, let's go ahead and move away from the story side and go into the game mechanics. We'll talk a little bit about that. And Final Fantasy IV does push the game mechanics in a pretty meaningful way. The battle system in particular is pushed forward into something remarkable. Up to 5 characters can be used in the battle, and that's something that we have not seen in a traditional Final Fantasy game before then, or even since. Now, that's not necessarily true if you take in Final Fantasy Tactics. There's also Final Fantasy Dimensions on mobile that actually has 5 character parties, but as a mainline Final Fantasy game, 5 characters is just crazy. That's insane to me, and I love it. This is also the first game in which we're introduced to the ATB, or Active Time Battle System. It's the system that most people think of when they think of classic Final Fantasy, especially like NES Final Fantasy, even Final Fantasy VII used it. Also, what's really interesting though is that the creator of the system, Hirojuki Ito, sorry if I messed that up, thought that these games, these JRPGs, would eventually evolve into battle systems that would be in real time, and this was his real first contribution to that goal. Now, let's see, was he right? Final Fantasy 15, real time? Yeah, I think he called it way back when in 1991, or 90, whenever they were developing this game. So that's pretty interesting. I had no idea about that. And just mechanically, it should be noted that while this game does have jobs, I mean, it's explicitly stated throughout the game, being a Dragoon, Paladin, Dark Knight, all of that, these jobs cannot be switched. So unlike Final Fantasy III, this is a game that has characters completely devoted to their job, and it's intertwined in their backstory in such a way that they wouldn't just change jobs as they see fit. We will go and see other games going forward, especially next month, Final Fantasy V, where you will see a job system that can be changed around and messed around with. But this is a more story-focused game, not necessarily more mechanically focused game. And I just want to put that out there, that you do see the classic jobs, but it doesn't have a job system like you might think. So now we've talked about the story, we've talked about the mechanics, let's go into the game itself and how it was released or distributed within the world. There's some pretty interesting facts about this game, specifically focused on the different localizations and re-releases around the world, and there's a lot of misinformation that even I've heard casually that I thought of until I actually looked at the game, did the research, and I've come across some pretty amazing things that I'm glad I came across because I was misinformed. So the misinformation that you're going to hear casually about Final Fantasy IV that I've found to be untrue is specifically focusing on the early releases. Now I'm going to just focus on 3 of the early versions, and those are going to be the Final Fantasy IV that we've seen in Japan, the one that came out for Super Famicom. We have Final Fantasy II that came out over here for the States, and then we have Final Fantasy IV Easy Type. I had originally thought that Final Fantasy Easy Type just was another option that was just an easier version of the game, Final Fantasy IV. You know, like you press start, pick easy or normal difficulty. That is not the case. Final Fantasy Easy Type seems to be a completely different released edition. Easy Type was also developed after the North American's Final Fantasy II, and it contains some similar translations with like vocabulary that seem to imply, at least from what I've found, that the Final Fantasy Easy Type version that released in Japan was actually a re-translated version from Final Fantasy II Super Nintendo Edition. It wasn't really made from the Final Fantasy IV Japan Edition and just scaled back and retranslated. So it's like almost like a double translation going from over here, and then they took our game and made it even easier and released it in Japan as an Easy Type. So that's, I don't know if you followed that, but it's kind of weird. There's also some abilities that were cut in the American Final Fantasy II, like Cecil's Darkness move, or sometimes it's called Dark Wave, which effectively sapped his life to deal damage to a group of enemies. Now this ability has changed a little bit for each of the remakes and re-releases, but it's always worked in similar ways. And there's a lot of other different things like that, but if I want to ever end this video, we just have to push on. I just want you to be aware that there are a lot of differences between the different releases of the game. Now, moving on to the game's music, of course it was made by Uematsu. They're timeless classic Final Fantasy songs that we all know and all love today. Of course, my favorite is the prologue, and we do have that classic throwback of the heroes leaving the castle to embark on their adventure a la Final Fantasy I, although this time it's under incredibly different circumstances. Let's finish up here with the many incarnations of this game. A lot of them are more than just re-releases with new shinier paint. A lot of them do have fundamentally different issues with them. So let's run through them real quick. We've already talked to death about the Super Famicom, Super Nintendo version, so I'm just gonna skip those. The next one I want to talk about is the Final Fantasy Chronicles on PlayStation. Final Fantasy Chronicles had Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy IV in it, and they had completely brand new full motion video sequences. And I gotta say, Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy IV packed together, that is one of the best game packages of like all time ever. Those two games, as you know, obviously I love Final Fantasy IV, but Chrono Trigger is also one of my favorite games ever. Having those together, just like mind blown. Final Fantasy Chronicles, definitely pick it up if you see it. I think you can actually still get it for a pretty good price now. The only downside here though is that the load times are atrocious. Next up, we have a few portable releases. One was the Wonder Swan Color, that was a portable in Japan. I believe I showed that in the Final Fantasy commercials video that I did. And one of them was a Game Boy Advance port that came out at the tail end of 2005. This also came out with an exclusive Game Boy Micro that was Japanese only, and man, that thing is beautiful. The last one I'd like to talk about is the PSP Final Fantasy IV Complete version. It has completely updated sprites, the music is fantastic, everything in this game is polished to such an incredible degree. And what you've been seeing here is me playing the Final Fantasy IV Complete version. Now this is where I'm going to get a little bit subjective. As far as the DS version goes, it's fine. I like it, I really do. But the engine is starting to show its age. These very low 3D poly counts I'm not a super big fan of. And while it does awesome stuff, there's a lot of cool stuff with the DS version, like voice acting, different music, just things like that. It seems a little bit subpar compared to the other versions of the game, in my opinion. While that being said, what really just saddens me is to see that they took that version and they basically ran with it. They've updated it, and that is the version that you'll see on Steam. It's the version you'll see on mobile devices. It is the most widespread version. And while I said it's not bad, just in my opinion, it is not the best. The pinnacle of all of the Final Fantasy IV releases is the complete version, the PSP version, which is, again, what you've been seeing me play here. It keeps its roots in 2D. It's some of the best quality sprites I've ever seen. It just feels exactly like the game originally did, except it has all of that fine polish all over it. You can get it for the PSP, you can get it on the Vita, and I highly urge you, if you want to play this game, try your best to get this Final Fantasy IV complete version. It also has Final Fantasy IV After Years, which we'll talk about next time, but that is the definitive version of the game. I really think it's a crime that they, for all intents and purposes, shoved that version to the side and taken the DS version to be supported over that masterpiece. If you can't get your hands on the DS version, those versions are fine, but they're just not as good as that PSP complete. Oh man, this is one of my longest videos ever. This is my incredibly long video on Final Fantasy IV, one of my favorite Final Fantasy games ever. In my opinion, if there was ever one game to play to get the quintessential Final Fantasy experience, it would be this game. There isn't even a contest in my mind. This may not be my favorite game of all time, but it is certainly up there. So please sit back and enjoy this masterpiece of a game.